I'm gonna share my screen. Here we go. And this to go away. Hold on, standing by. There we go. So I've called this presentation, They Want to Build What? What's the deal with data centers in Clifton Township? And before you get too excited, this picture here is just a generic picture of a data center. It has nothing to do with anything that's being specifically proposed in Clifton Township. It was just a visual aid. So to start out, I want to talk a little bit about what is a data center, or if you prefer a data center. Pronunciation is a matter of personal choice, I guess. But a data center is a facility that houses digital infrastructure like servers, data storage drives, and network equipment. To simplify it to its core, it is basically a warehouse full of computer stuff. It could house the infrastructure for either a single business or entity, so think like Google or Microsoft or some other company that has like a ton of computing power. They might have like their own data center or multiple data centers, or you might have several smaller businesses that are all sharing a data center, and that type of facility is called a co-location or colo facility. And just so everyone knows, a data center is not the same thing as crypto mining or Bitcoin mining. That's kind of another thing that's just a big building full of computers, so they seem kind of similar. They're not actually the same thing. Please don't ask me to explain how Bitcoin mining works or anything about Bitcoin, but just so you know, they're not the same thing. So just to explain more about what happens in a data center, let's imagine that you are at home and you are using your computer, and let's say that you are watching YouTube videos or uploading videos of or pictures of your cat to Instagram or saving documents. And we talk about things being saved to the cloud, but of course we are not actually putting our data or anything like that in a literal cloud. The cloud is actually data centers. All of this stuff, the physical infrastructure that is needed to make things like YouTube and Netflix and Instagram and AI work, it's all housed, for the most part, in these buildings called data centers. And of course, it's not just people's personal computing that's happening here. We're talking about business entities like hospitals, banks, offices, financial companies, anybody who has need for a lot of computing power. Often that happens in a data center. So you might be wondering, oh, why is this in a separate building? Why would somebody put digital infrastructure somewhere else? Why don't they just keep it in the building wherever their business is? Like, why don't they just put it in the hospital or the bank? Well, there's a couple reasons why people choose data centers. First is just space, and depending on how much of this digital infrastructure you need, you might just not have the room for it in whatever building that you occupy generally as your business. Another thing is security, both physical, in the form of things as simple as a fence or a security guard or locks on the door, that kind of thing. Also digital security, so things like virus protection can happen in a more enhanced way in the data centers. You would also have staff there that can monitor the equipment. And some of the most important things that make data centers appealing is there is climate control, so making sure that the room that the computer stuff is in is at a temperature that is, peak efficiency for that equipment. And then protection against power interruptions. So when you are storing all of your digital data somewhere, it's very bad if the power goes out. People who are using this want to have constant access to it. And so a lot of what a data center is doing is protecting this stuff against power outages. So what goes on inside a data center? Also, I think a couple of people are not muted. If you don't mind muting yourself, I hear some chatter in the background a little bit. So data center, what's going on inside the building? Here's a fun little drawing that is a little bit of a schematic. So we'll talk about the different parts. First thing is called the server hall or server room. This is kind of the main thing that the data center is. This is where all of this computing infrastructure is. It's located in these rows called racks. And in the drawing, you can see it's kind of just a cabinet, and there's like disks and microchips and stuff in there. I don't know that much about tech to describe it in any more detail. And the servers might also be enclosed in cages to control access, especially if you have multiple companies sharing a data center and they don't want somebody from company X to be able to access company Y's stuff. It's in a cage with a lock on it, and only the people who can access that will get the key to it. Here's a photograph of what that looks like in real life. It's, just a really big room full of computery looking stuff. The next thing is the cooling system, which is, as far as space and importance, this is almost as much space as the actual server hall. As we talked about a few minutes ago, keeping the computer equipment cool is important because, as you likely know from your laptop or computer at home, if it gets overheated, it does not work. So a big part of what data centers are doing is maintaining the temperature so that the digital infrastructure is functioning. And this is actually what drives the size of data centers often, the physical size, is the ability to cool. So all of these racks, like you can see in this picture we just had, you could jam those things a lot closer together physically. Like you could smush all that next to each other. And the reason you can't do that is they need to have airflow to keep it cool. So that's what is driving the size of the building. Here's a diagram of how that works. You have something, usually a chiller, which cools down water. These pipes on the drawing here, there's water inside here. So the chiller cools down the water. It goes up into this air conditioning unit that is either in or near the server hall. The air conditioning unit blows air across the cool coils of water, usually through a system that's under the floor. It goes up around the servers, cools down the servers, and then the hot air that the servers are creating gets blown out the back, gets circulated back into the air conditioning unit, and then the warmed up water that's in there circulates back to the chiller, and then the chiller uses some refrigerant in there. It's similar to an air conditioner that you have at home. The refrigerant then transfers the heat to another loop full of water. So the warm water goes up to the evaporator, which is usually on the roof. The water goes through the evaporator, it evaporates, and then cooler water returns back into the system. And when we're going to talk a little bit later about water consumption at the data center, this process is what is consuming a lot of the water, this evaporation that is cooling making the chiller work. Oh, sorry. Just to get a sense of just how much space this takes up in a data center, I have a little clip from a YouTube video, which is a tour of a data center. And you can see in here, just how much space in the data center is occupied by this cooling equipment.
That hot water comes over to the centrifugal chillers here, which then exchanges that heat and concentrates it to the evaporation system and the cooling towers. So for an idea of scale, your normal residential air conditioning unit for a house is usually anywhere from 3 to 5 tons. Each one of these green units here is 1,050.
So you can see there that, there's not just one of these, there's probably, I think this one had 6 or 8, and they take up a pretty big chunk of space in there. The next important thing that data centers have is generators. Like we talked about earlier, one of the main functions of the data center is to prevent power interruption to this digital infrastructure. So the data center will be connected to the grid, a power supply, and that's the main source of electricity. But in case something happens there, so there's a big storm, something falls on the power lines, rogue squirrels, whatever, and the regular power goes out, they have these generators that will kick on in that event, much like you might have a backup generator at your house. But as with the chilling units, this is at a completely different scale. So another section of this video will show the size of the generator.
What we're looking at is the diesel generator backbone to the data center. So power goes out. This is ultimately what kicks on, to provide power for the building. This situation, you have the cold air will come in from this side of the building, goes through, gets sucked through the radiator, and then out the louvers on the backside. That will all automatically open up at the point that these things are requested to turn on. And again, these things go from sitting still, not on, to full 60 mile an hour, ear bleeding rush in about 16 seconds. If these come.
So you can see the size of the generator, and one of the things that data centers usually incorporate is a fair amount of redundancy. So they will have not only the amount of generators that they need to run the data center if the power goes out, they will have extra generators in case something goes wrong with those generators. The next thing that you have in the data center is something called the uninterrupted power supply, or UPS. This is basically a giant battery, and it's part of that no interruption to the power system. So you heard the guy in the video say a second ago that if they lose power, it takes about 16 seconds for those generators to kick on. This is what supplies the power during those 16 seconds. And so that's, kind of a big cabinet type thing in one room. There's also something called a meet me room, or MMR. This is kind of where all the connections happen, either in the data center or between the data center and the outside world. So like fiber optic cables that are providing internet service and connecting all the infrastructure to all the users out in the world. That comes in here and gets connected to the stuff that's in the data center. The stuff in the data center is connected to each other inside here. That's where all that happens. And then we also have some administrative type stuff that we don't really talk about, like offices, bathrooms, that kind of thing. So moving to the outside of the data center, some things you might see are a water tank. So the water tank is storing water that's used for that cooling system we talked about. It also provides, to some extent, some cooling for the water. So if it's cool outside, the water in the tank will lose heat, and then the chillers don't have to work as hard. And we also have the evaporation towers, cooling towers, that we saw in the diagram a little bit a while ago. The water will get pumped into that and evaporate and cool down, and then go back into the system. The generators in our drawing in that video were inside, but they could also be outside. So that might look like that. You are likely to also see a substation. And this is a thing that it's not specific to data centers or anything. We see these all over the place. This is just the infrastructure that takes the high voltage from the high voltage power lines and steps it down into electric voltage that can be used inside the building. So, we're not frying the equipment or electrocuting anybody. In some cases, there's also on-site electric generation. So instead of being connected to the grid, or in addition to being connected to the grid, the data center might be using its own on-site power in the form of wind, natural gas, or solar. So why do we care about the data centers? I assume you all already care about the data centers because you came to this presentation to hear me talk about it for an hour. But just in case you don't know why you should care about data centers, there's a couple reasons. The campuses, they can be very large, so this equates to a lot of land disturbance and impervious coverage, which has a good deal of environmental impact, from wildlife habitat to water quality concerns. So, if you've heard us talk about warehouses, it's kind of like that, but even more. A less localized impact in most cases, but still a concern is that these things use massive amounts of power. So that power comes from somewhere, and this can drive demand for fossil fuel energy generation if that's where the power is coming from. You can use a lot of water for the cooling system. We talked about the evaporation system. A lot of water kind of gets released into the air through that process. So they are kind of constantly having to draw new water to run that system. And there's also potential for noise pollution. This depends on a lot of factors, such as location, the type of equipment, how close it is to other stuff. But yeah, that is something that can happen. One thing that is not really a concern, which is different from what we've been looking at a lot with the warehouses popping up all over the place. Not a ton of traffic generated from these uses. They don't tend to have a whole lot of employees, like a very large facility might have a couple dozen employees. So we're not talking about, 100,000 trips of cars or trucks in and out every day. So that's something. So now let's move on to what is going on in Clifton Township specifically regarding the data centers. So it is important to remember as we go through this whole conversation for the next however many minutes that we are talking about two separate things that are happening kind of simultaneously in Clifton Township, which is possibly causing some confusion, but we want to make sure that we keep these two things straight and understand that they are two different things. I don't know. Oh, sorry, my animation on this slide went a little janky. So thing number one is that we have a proposed ordinance amendment. Thing number two is a substantive validity challenge. We're going to talk about each of those separately, starting with, surprisingly, thing number one. So the Clifton Township Board of Supervisors has advertised that they are considering an ordinance amendment to address data centers. Currently, the Clifton Township zoning ordinance does not mention data centers at all. There's nothing in there that says specifically where a data center should be located, what kind of restrictions there are on it. It's just silent on data centers. And the Board of Supervisors rightly realized that this is kind of an issue, which we will see when we get to thing number two. So they have proposed an ordinance amendment to change this and add some stuff into the zoning ordinance so that data centers are dealt with. And this is something that we at Penn Future approve of. Oh, I forgot I had this in here. Yes, the fact that there is no language in the ordinance right now kind of puts us in a situation where there are almost no rules for data centers, and we don't want that. We want there to be rules. So here's what the Board of Supervisors is proposing in the draft ordinance amendment, which I think is available on their website. If not, you can email me and I'll send it to you. First thing it does is add some definitions of data center and data center accessory uses and data center equipment. Those last two things are kind of addressing that stuff that's connected to the data center, but maybe isn't the building itself. So like the water tower and the power infrastructure and that kind of stuff. It says that data centers will be allowed as a conditional use, which means that will require approval from the Board of Supervisors in the I industrial district in Clifton Township. So there's a little a portion of the zoning map there, and you can see the I industrial district is that kind of golden colored area, kind of along 380 in the vicinity of Clifton Beach Road. Proposed ordinance also adds some standards for data centers, which is great. This includes the requirement that they have to have access to a collector or arterial road, which are, you know, defined in more detail in the ordinance, but it's basically like the main roads and not just back roads. There is a 50-foot woodland buffer requirement on all sides, so essentially you have to have trees all the way around it. A 100-foot setback from any adjoining residential districts or uses. 35-foot maximum building height, prohibiting external equipment between the building and the road or between the building and residential uses. And there are also a number of things that are required that are kind of to provide more information or assurance that some of the main concerns will be addressed. So the ordinance would require a water feasibility study, would require proof that either the Delaware River Basin Commission or the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, depending on which river basin you are in the township. If you're withdrawing more than 100,000 gallons per day or consuming over 20,000 gallons per day, consuming means taking the water out of the watershed, not putting it back. So if in those two situations, the River Basin Commission would have to approve that. Also proof that the electric service provider has, like knows about this and has said, yes, you can connect to the electric grid and we will supply the power. It requires a sound study at multiple stages of construction, I think. So like during construction and during the operation of the building. And then there are limits to how much noise the building or equipment can make. This is all great. So what can you do when it comes to this ordinance amendment? Well, you can attend the Board of Supervisors meeting, which is scheduled for May 22nd at 7 o'clock at the Township Building. And you can express support for the ordinance. You can also, if you have comments on things that might be improved or questions about it, this meeting is the place to go. But in general, we at Penn Future think this is definitely a good start and is certainly an improvement over having nothing at all in the zoning ordinance, which is a problem. And that's a good segue into thing number 2 that is going on in Clifton Township right now, and that is your substantive validity challenge.
Sorry, before we move on, can I just ask a quick question about the proposed ordinance?
Sure, I can.
Unless it's better to wait all questions till the end, that's also fine.
Now I think we can do it. Let me just see if I can. Can you guys see me?
I can't see you, but I can see the
I can
slides.
see the screen. Okay. Let me briefly stop the sharing.
Oh,
Okay, there we go.
I can also go on video. So I guess one question would be, it sounds like Penn Future says this ordinance is a good start, but are there things that you would suggest pushing to be stronger? And does the ordinance, how it's written, basically take the current data center proposal out of play? Like, would they not be able to meet those things? Because my goal would be to have an ordinance written that basically makes it impossible for any data center to open. So like, does this ordinance still allow for the one that is interested in coming to somehow meet all of those standards? And if so, what would we change in that ordinance so that no one can meet the standard?
Well, we're going to talk about that actually more in the substantive validity section. In essence, the township is actually not allowed to intentionally write an ordinance to try to block the use out. They, under the Pennsylvania Constitution, they are required to make to accommodate all legal, legitimate land uses. So they can put restrictions around it. There are certainly things they can do to say, well, it's not going to be the easiest here. It's not just a free-for-all to build here. But when it gets to the point where you're saying, well, we want to write this ordinance so that they can't develop that, that's how you get a substantive validity challenge, which is what we're going to talk about in a minute.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to go back to sharing. Here we go. Okay, so here we are, part 2, substantive validity challenge. And I've got our little guy there saying, buckle up because it's about to get wonky. Where'd my graphic go? There we go. So again, just to remind everybody, this is a different process that's kind of happening in tandem, but is technically a separate thing. And to understand the substantive validity challenge, we get to go back to the Pennsylvania Constitution. So the Pennsylvania Constitution, much like the United States Constitution, guarantees property owners the right to enjoy their property. And as I think we all probably understand, that right is not unlimited. The right to enjoy your property can be reasonably limited, usually through zoning ordinances, that place controls over what you can do, like where you can build certain things, how close it can be to other stuff. This is all normal. We're used to this. And as long as your zoning ordinance is not arbitrary or just unreasonably restrictive of property, the use of private property, everything is good. But one thing that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has decided is not a reasonable use of zoning is to have a zoning ordinance that completely excludes a legitimate use from a municipality. Pennsylvania Supreme Court has said that this is, in almost every case, unreasonable and therefore unconstitutional. An ordinance that does this, that makes it so that you cannot develop a specific use in a municipality, is referred to as being exclusionary. And I guess since we brought it up a second ago, there's 2 different ways that this can happen. One is where the ordinance just sort of doesn't address a particular use at all. It's just completely silent and there's nothing in there that says that you can build a particular use. And that's kind of the path we're on with this substantive validity challenge. But there's actually another version of this where the ordinance on its face says that you can build the thing, but then they put so many restrictions on it so that it's functionally impossible. And that's kind of like we were talking about in theory just a second ago, saying, well, we'll make an ordinance that says you can build a data center, but we will make it so restrictive that nobody will actually be able to build a data center. Both of these things are unconstitutional because they are, quote, exclusionary. So what happens if you have an exclusionary ordinance? Well, you might have somebody like this angry man in this picture right here who wants to develop something and they say, well, wait a minute, your ordinance excludes that thing. So in this case, we have somebody who's like, I want to build a data center, but your ordinance does not seem to allow me to do that. I am upset about that. I am challenging your ordinance and I say that it's invalid and it has to be struck down. That is what a substantive validity challenge is. This person coming to the township and saying, I challenge your ordinance as being unconstitutional and you have to fix it. The substantive validity challenge is heard by the zoning hearing board, not the board of supervisors, so they are in charge of making this decision. In this case, in Clifton Township right now, we have a developer with a very generic name. It seems to be variously JCO or 1778 Rich Pike LLC is the name of the applicant or the challenger in this situation. And they are claiming that the Clifton Township zoning ordinance is unconstitutional because it excludes data centers, data center equipment, data center accessory uses, and also private power generation facilities. And just to be clear, here we are talking about the existing ordinance, not the one that they are thinking about adopting in a couple weeks. We're talking about the ordinance as it stands right now. Why am I not? There we go. So the way that this is decided, the way the zoning hearing board approaches this, can be thought of as a three-step process. The first thing the zoning hearing board has to decide is whether or not the ordinance is actually exclusionary. Is it true that it is not possible under the current zoning ordinance to build, for an example, a data center? And you might think that, well, this is pretty easy. If, the word data center doesn't appear anywhere in the ordinance, it's obviously exclusionary, right? Well, it's not actually that easy in all cases. You might have some situations where a zoning ordinance does not actually name a particular use, but it is still not exclusionary. So some examples might be the supposedly excluded use might fall under the definition of something else that is allowed and is provided for in the zoning ordinance. So for example, I was involved in a case once where a landowner said that a wedding barn was a specific land use and it wasn't addressed in the zoning ordinance, so the zoning ordinance was exclusionary. And the zoning hearing board and subsequently the courts decided, well, that's not really the case because a wedding barn isn't like a separate thing. It's a subcategory of an event venue, which was provided for in the ordinance. So you don't have to have like a separate category for wedding barn because a wedding barn is just considered an event venue and that is dealt with in the ordinance. Some ordinances also have a kind of catch-all generic provision somewhere that says any use that's not provided in this ordinance is allowed in the industrial district as a conditional use or something like that. Something designed to kind of catch anything that is not specifically addressed. And courts have generally decided that if that's the case, somebody comes in with a use that's not addressed in the ordinance, well, they can develop under that catch-all provision, and that's fine. So those are two examples of how an ordinance might not actually be exclusionary, even if it doesn't look like it is dealing with a certain use. And for step one, it's important to remember that the focus is really on the ordinance itself, not the details or the specifics of what the challenger wants to do with the land. The first question is just looking at the language of the ordinance and understanding kind of generally what this use is that the challenger is interested in. Is it possible under this zoning ordinance to develop this somewhere in the township? So that is for a lot of, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. That is kind of a legal question that is focusing on the language of the ordinance. So steps 2 and 3, actually, they only happen if the challenger succeeds in step 1 and the zoning hearing board decides that the ordinance is exclusionary. If the zoning hearing board gets through step 1 and they say, well, actually, no, this is not exclusionary. You could develop this data center under a different definition, or maybe there's this catch-all thing, anything like that, however they come to that decision. If they decide that the ordinance is not exclusionary, that's kind of the end of the thing. Steps 2 and 3 do not occur if step 1 does not go the challenger's way. So from here on out, this stuff only happens if the zoning hearing board concludes that the ordinance does in fact exclude the data center. The first thing is that the ordinance, if the zoning hearing board decides that it is unconstitutional and exclusionary, the ordinance has to get fixed. So what happens in that case? Because the zoning hearing board cannot itself adopt a new ordinance, the zoning hearing board recommends an ordinance amendment to the Board of Supervisors that will, fix, it's called curing the defect in the ordinance. In this case, it would be amendments that would allow for the development of data centers somewhere in Clifton Township. That's what you do to fix an exclusionary ordinance. You amend your ordinance so that the excluded use is allowed somewhere. In this case, since the township is in the process of already considering an amendment, I would think the zoning hearing board would be like, yeah, that one, just we recommend that you adopt that one, but they could, in theory, recommend something else. Step 3 is where things get interesting. So a challenger who successfully proves that the ordinance is exclusionary, so we've gotten through step 1 and 2, they're kind of the prize or reward for bringing the successful challenge is that they are entitled to what is called site-specific relief. This means they are entitled to develop the land as proposed in plans and the other materials submitted with the challenge. And I guess this is a good time to talk about what this particular challenger in Clifton Township is proposing. So a couple slides about that. Here is an image of the plans that they submitted with the substantive validity challenge. First thing to know is that the plans have very little detail at this stage. They're not going through land development approval or anything like that. The only thing they're doing right now is demonstrating pretty roughly like what do we want to build and where. So keep that in mind. We don't have a ton of information at this stage. What we can tell from the plans that were submitted is that this would be a project that is split between Clifton and Covington Township. This red dotted line down the middle of the page, that's the border between the two townships. And just to help orient yourself, the I-380 is going through the center of the picture here. North is to the right. And then we have Clifton Beach Road kind of down here at the bottom left. Altogether, the entire site between the two townships is about 1,000 acres, and these plans show 35 data center buildings. Each one is 126,500 square feet and 3 stories high, again, on these plans. They also have 3 different locations where they have sort of labeled this is where a substation would go. Not really clear whether they would be thinking about having 3 separate substations or just we'll pick one of these places. And there's also an area that is described as being reserved for future power generation. And that is this, you can see this sort of big block of text at the bottom left side of the screen. I'm sorry, I could not get it so you could actually read anything on the screen. So this is, it's a pretty massive project, a lot of land disturbance, a lot of buildings. And at Penn Future, of course, we are concerned about environmental impacts. And so I have done my own overlay of the wetlands inventory mapping tool of the plan. And you can see all of these green blobs are wetlands. And then we also have a number of streams that are flowing in close proximity to this project. These would all be exceptional value streams, which means they have the highest water quality in the state of Pennsylvania. So again, not a lot of detail. We don't really have any information about how they are dealing with stormwater, anything like that, but it is concerning that this is all proposed very close to a number of water resources. There's also potentially a concern with water withdrawals. Don't have a ton of information about that either. But if this is kind of a typical data center proposal that is using a lot of water, we could be looking at concerns about the water withdrawals, the water table, the aquifers, all of that stuff. Again, not a lot of details right now. So this is just very general stuff that we are flagging as potential concerns. So back to how the substantive validity challenge plays out. When it comes to site-specific relief, the major thing is that the challenger's plans are not subject to any ordinance amendments that come about in step 2. So if the zoning hearing board says, yes, this is exclusionary, we need to fix the ordinance, and then the Board of Supervisors writes a new ordinance and adopts it and says, okay, we fixed it, it's not exclusionary anymore, that ordinance does not apply to this plan. And that's kind of considered a way of being fair to the challenger and preventing the municipality from fixing the problem with the ordinance in a way that doesn't help the challenger at all. So they could say, all right, we're going to allow data centers somewhere in the township, but it's not going to be anywhere near where you want to build it. And that courts have decided is not really fair, so the new ordinance cannot apply to the challenge. But this does not mean that there is like a free-for-all, carte blanche, blank check, or anything like that. There are some limits on what the challenger gets as the site-specific relief. First thing is that the successful challenger is required to follow reasonable regulations that are generally applicable to the use or the zoning district, such as building requirements, density restrictions, safety measures, and water and sewage regulations. This language is actually straight out of a Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision, and if you are a fan of legal citations, there it is down at the bottom. So in this case, the developer might be looking at things like height limitations, lot coverage limitations, and setbacks that are generally applicable in the zoning district where the thing is located. Another thing is that the proposed use must also be reasonable and not injurious to the public health, safety, welfare, and morals. That's a little bit more of a squishy concept, but luckily the municipality's planning code, which is the state law that kind of governs local land use decision making, has given us a list of factors that the zoning hearing board must consider in this regard, and they include things like the impact of the proposed use on roads, sewer facilities, water supplies, and other public service facilities, as well as the suitability of and the impact to the site's soils, slopes, woodlands, wetlands, floodplains, aquifers, natural resources, and other natural features. So the MPC, that's short for Municipalities Planning Code, tells the zoning hearing board that they have to consider these things. It doesn't really say, well, what's too far? What's too much of an impact? Too much of a problem? That's where the zoning hearing board has to exercise some kind of discretion. So to kind of wrap all of that up, when it comes to the site-specific relief, basically the zoning hearing board is not allowed to totally prohibit the proposed use or to subject it to unreasonable or burdensome restrictions, but it is allowed to subject it to reasonable restrictions in the ordinance. And part of what the zoning hearing board's job is, if it gets to this stage 3, is to figure out how to fashion the site-specific relief according to those rules. So finding, the balance between not totally blocking out the use, but also not making it so that it is unreasonable. There's another fun legal citation for everyone who likes to look up legal stuff. So you might be wondering, well, where does the new ordinance that the Board of Supervisors is planning to consider later this month, where does that all fit in? Why does that apply to this project? And if not, why not? Well, the answer is it does not apply to this project. And that is because the challenger, the data center developer, they filed the substantive validity challenge before the Board of Supervisor announced that it was going to advertise the new ordinance. And this was all very close in time. I think it was a difference of hours, but the rule is if the substantive validity challenge gets filed before the municipality formally announces that they are advertising a new ordinance, then the new ordinance does not apply to the thing. So that means even if it is adopted, the new ordinance that they're thinking about later this month, that is not going to apply to this project. I guess the caveat, of course, is if the zoning hearing board rejects the validity challenge and says, no, this ordinance was not exclusionary, then the developer will be forced to proceed like under the new ordinance, assuming it exists. So when it comes to the substantive validity challenge, what can you do? Again, it is attending the zoning hearing board hearing where they decide this. As far as I know, right now the date is TBD. It was originally scheduled for later this month, but they have now pushed it back to sometime in July, but I don't think they have set a date yet. And once you get to the hearing, step one is honestly kind of a lot of legal argument and interpretation of the ordinance. So like the possibility for public participation there is somewhat limited, like unless you really want to make a legal argument about interpreting the zoning ordinance, that's a lot, but you can. Really, public participation is more important if and when we get to step, oh sorry, that says step 2. It's supposed to say step 3. If you have evidence or comments about the proposed use potential impacts on public health, safety, and welfare, or if for some reason you have feelings about the data center's impact on the public morals, you can throw that in there too. Some things you would want to maybe talk about would be like the impacts on the streams and the wetlands, concerns about the water withdrawals, like there's basically no information in that application or challenge, so like asking questions about what is going to happen, is this going to affect the water resources locally. And also I know when we had the warehouse hearing a couple weeks ago or months ago now, there were concerns about fire safety. So, talking about if this is built the way it is proposed, then, will there be concerns about fire safety? It seems like there are a lot of folks there who are involved in the various fire departments who can answer that question more than I can, but it would be something to think about. And then, of course, just sort of being there and present and, letting it be known that that the challenger does not get a blank check, even if they succeed in the challenge, so that reasonable requirements in the ordinance have to be followed and kind of holding the zoning hearing board to that standard. And I believe that's the end of my slides. I'm going to stop. Oh, look at that. And have not run out of time yet. So thank you all for listening to me talk for an hour. Now you can talk at me if you'd like. By which I mean ask questions.
I have another question, sorry.
Go ahead.
Since this proposal straddles 2 townships, and we only talked about the proposed ordinance for Clifton Township, what role does Covington have to play? Like, do they already have an ordinance about data centers? Do they not? And the same process will have to happen over there?
I have less information about Covington Township, and I believe, do not have their ordinance online, which was kind of annoying. As far as I understand, they are sort of amenable to it and are maybe working with the developers. I heard that like second or third hand, so I do not know.
Okay.
But generally speaking, like, they control the land use within their own township, so they will ultimately decide how they handle, everything that's happening on their side of the line.
Okay, but as like community members who live near both, we should try to potentially be involved in both township processes then?
Yes. If
Okay.
there is, like, I don't know what,
There
if
may
any,
not be
process is
one.
happening in Covington right now. I have
Okay.
not heard
Okay.
of them doing anything right now, so they might just be kind of cruising along in
Yeah.
Covington.
And then one other question, is there any precedent for streams of exceptional value being just completely off limits for development? Like, is that attacked since they would have to destroy pieces of the stream or
Yeah.
its riparian barrier.
Like, yeah, I don't think they're, yeah, like my lining up of the maps is probably not perfect. Like, I don't think they're proposing to build anything like literally in a stream. And there are state regulations that will prevent them from building, for the most part, within 150 feet of the exceptional value streams. I think Drew was on here somewhere. He can tell us all about that. Um, but yeah, in general, there are protective state laws around the riparian buffers. Unfortunately, the state law does not apply to wetlands. So there's less protection there on that side. And that is a place where townships can step in. I know Coolbaugh has done so recently. It's I guess you guys are in Lackawanna, but the Monroe County Act 167 plan suggests that, you know, having buffers around these things. Different townships approach it differently. I don't believe I've looked at Clifton to see what kind of buffers they have. I should do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the presentation. Uh, I guess the question that I would have is, if you live around this proposed data center city, it shouldn't matter if you're right in Covington or Clifton, you still would have standing in this, correct?
Oh, standing can get complicated. It's kind of on a case-to-case basis, but certainly anybody can go attend a public meeting and comment on it if you are like literally trying to become a party to this proceeding.
Right.
That gets a little trickier.
Well, if you attend the zoning hearing board, that would be, right, a question that they would ask, right? Not so much the board of supervisors, but the zoning hearing board.
Regarding standing, you mean?
Yeah, regarding standing.
Only if you want to participate in the hearing as a party. We didn't really go into that.
Okay.
So
All right.
parties, you know, sort of have an expanded role in the hearing, like, you know, the ability to question the other party's witnesses or present their own evidence and like make legal arguments.
All right.
That is something that people who become parties can do, and that's typically people who are in very close proximity to the project.
Okay.
If you just want to make a public comment, you don't have to meet that.
Yeah.
Hey, Bridget, would the developer be amenable to developing in one township but not the other? For instance, you said,
Yeah, that I cannot tell you. That would be, you know, kind of a business decision on their part, and they
yeah,
haven't told me any of their business plans.
just interesting that Clifton, well, my takeaway is Clifton is not interested in this, but Covington might be. So then maybe. So that's a big,
Yeah,
we don't have any answers for, but that could end up quite, you know, maybe dissatisfying the developer to the point where the project becomes less favorable. You know, I don't know. That's all speculative.
yeah, that would really just come down to the developers, you know, what they need out of the project, what they consider to be profitable, and I am certainly not privy to that information.
Right. It's interesting though, because they would need approval from both townships to move forward.
Yeah, to build the entire thing as they showed on the plans, they would need approval from both townships. I guess if things don't work out in one or the other, they could just do half of it. Like there's nothing like that would legally prevent them from doing that. I just don't know if that's something that they would consider worthwhile from their point of view.
Do they already own this land?
I believe they either own it or have like, you know, they're the equitable owners, so like they have an agreement with the landowner.
Beneficial ownership, he said.
Yeah. It's in,
So
it- it's,
disappointing that neighbors would felt.
Yeah.
Well, it raises a question for other townships. I'm thinking about my own township where there's a tremendous amount of land available for a project like this. And, the question is, how can we be proactive? I don't think our ordinances address data centers. I
yeah,
guess,
almost hardly any ordinances do right now because, this is kind of like the warehouses or the distribution centers 10 to 15 years ago. It's just like nobody's ever heard of it until recently. It
Go to
didn't really
your,
touch on it in the presentation, but one thing that is driving more need for these than we've seen in the past is the advent of the generative AI, which uses just like an extraordinary amount of computing power. And so, whereas like these have existed for as long as the internet, basically, but the fact that they are sort of now entering into areas that had not heard of them before, part of that is being driven by the fact that we now have AI in our lives.
yeah, I would go to your township meeting and, it, and I would announce this. I've already put the word out in Cuba. We were at a town hall just maybe 2 weeks ago, and we brought it up there. We read exactly what was going on, in Clifton and Covington. I think that June wants to ask a question, but June, you're on mute. She's still on mute.
I'll chime in here. Bridget, thanks for your presentation. Super helpful. I don't know a lot of you who live nearby, but our property, I don't live in the area, but my family owns property that immediately abuts the industrial land in Clifton Township. So, we obviously don't really want to see this happen at all. And I just wanted to, say hello. I'm going to try to get down for the did you say there was a meeting on, or I thought I saw something about a meeting on May 22nd? Do you know if that one's still happening?
As far as I know,
Yes.
that is the meeting where they are going to discuss adopting the new ordinance. So
Okay,
that's not going to involve this specific proposal at all. This is
right,
just, getting language into the ordinance for projects going forward.
right. And yeah, what you explained about how the fact that the timing of the ordinance announcement was after the proposal by the developer, that does make sense to me. But my comment just for the world is it's pretty crazy. It's like kids making rules like, well, you didn't say we couldn't do this, so we're just gonna, assume that we can, right? It's almost comical that what
Yeah,
the
it's kind of not this whole exclusionary rule is I know Pennsylvania and New Jersey have this rule. I don't know of any other states that do. Like it's not common that you have basically a constitutional requirement that every use has to be allowed in every township. So that's kind of a quirk of Pennsylvania law. It's a double-edged sword. It prevents folks from writing zoning ordinances so that you can't ever develop multifamily housing and effectively keeping people out of the township. And the other side is that every municipality does end up having to deal with well, I want to build a data center and you can't tell me I can't build it here no matter how bad of an idea it is to build it here.
right.
I have mixed feelings about the exclusionary zoning rule.
I also find it interesting that the zoning hearing board, the onus is on them to make that very big decision. And I, just speaking from the experience I have with our zoning hearing board, they do have a, legal representation, but generally they are, lay people who are good citizens who just want to do the right thing. And so they're confronted with a pretty significant decision. And I guess in large part, they just defer to their legal representation and go with whatever, input they get. Is that a good assumption on my part? I mean, how can they make these decisions? I guess I'm perplexed by
I
that.
mean, I certainly can't speak to the dynamics between like the Clifton Township zoning hearing board and their solicitor. Now, hopefully a good solicitor explains this is the decision you have to make. Here are the things that you have to consider, but you ultimately have to make the decision.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Did
this
you
this is
see,
a very strange um, legal thing that there's actually the challenger sort of has an option of bringing this kind of challenge before the zoning hearing board or the board of supervisors. And like they're slightly different, but there are two almost identical tracks that the challenger can take. I don't know why that's the case, and I don't know why in this case they chose the zoning hearing board, but it's another kind of weird quirk of Pennsylvania law that they could have brought this in front of the board of supervisors.
did you see if there was anything in the ordinance that Clifton had as a catch-all bucket, or you really didn't review that?
Um, I think they do. We will have to see how will get interpreted. I haven't dug too deeply into the ordinance, but I think they might have that language, so that might end up being a good thing for them.
I hope so.
What other things besides going to the meetings, what resources can we get lined up or prepare to line up so that we're positioned to be able to at least, meet them at their own level kind of thing when they're proposing all these things? Because the questions or the things that are going to be brought up and some of the technical concerns are going to be well out of the wheelhouse of many people. What kind of resources should we be thinking about putting in position to get ahead of this?
Uh, I think probably learning what you can about data centers generally so that you kind of know what questions to ask. Also, if you're really looking to get organized and have somebody who wants to participate as a party, so like that person would have the ability to ask questions of the developer. Other people can't. Well, you can ask, but they won't necessarily be forced to answer you. So if you have somebody who lives in the immediate vicinity and you can say like, I will definitely be affected by this because it's like next door to my house.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm more thinking about like they're going to put a proposal on the table that's going to say, our cooling system is going to look like XYZ, our power generation is going to look like, ABC kind of thing. And we can we can have resources at our disposal to say, this isn't standard or this is problematic. I don't know the right terminology to
yeah,
use. I do have some experience in data centers because I spent some time in them and helped build some of them, but I don't have anywhere near the expertise to be able to challenge some of this stuff. So, and especially I'm out of it 5 years and it changes daily, you know what I mean? So I want to make sure that if we can, let's look for resources that can just help us understand and be able to challenge things. That's, I'm not talking about people directly impacted. I'm just talking about the overall group so that if anybody steps up to the table to say, I want to be a party to this, they're supported in a way that's, makes intelligent decisions and remarks, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I actually, I'll have to see if I can find it. I actually watched a pretty good series of videos about data centers on YouTube. No, I don't need that. I will put this link in the chat. I think this YouTube channel was called something like Data Center Hawk, something like weirdly aggressive. And it seems like they are actually data center developers, so they have a whole series of videos talking about a lot of the workings of the data center, and that helped me a lot to understand what was happening, like just what the different options are, the different sizes. So if you really want to, watch, you know, endless hours of videos, there's that. See if I can find the one.
While you're looking, Bridget, it wouldn't, for example, North Pocono Care be a party to this because this will impact the Lehigh River, and they are they are downstream of the river from where the proposed site is. Does that constitute standing that you could be potentially affected along the river, shall I say?
Yeah. Ultimately, like who gets to have standing is up to the zoning hearing board. They're actually allowed to give standing to anybody they want to. But the only people that they are required to allow to have standing are people who are like aggrieved, I think the word is. And the way it works out is typically, people who live in close proximity. And as much as we hate it ourselves as an environmental organization at Penn Future, it's usually not enough to say, well, we're here representing a certain the interest in an environmental resource. Again, like the zoning hearing board ultimately makes the call. The rules are kind of lax at the local hearing, but often there's pushback from the developer if it's somebody who they don't feel like needs to have standing.
Hey, Bridget, I remember in the previous session about the warehouse proposal, you
Yeah.
talked about being a party. And I think you went through some of like the upside and the downside of being a party. Like if you become a party, you're sort of exposing yourself to like it's almost like being the witness in court, or is it something akin to that?
No, it's more like being a litigant in court. You're not really exposing yourself to anything.
Okay.
You, um, like I think somebody was going around saying with the warehouse that, oh, if you become a party at the zoning hearing board, then if it gets appealed to court, then like you're sort of dragged into some kind of court battle you don't want to be into.
Exactly. Yes. They said
Yeah,
that.
that's not the case. Like there's nothing that would obligate you to participate as a party if there was an appeal in court. Like you can drop out whenever you want.
Got it.
Um,
Great. Thank you.
basically just gives you the right to participate in a couple ways in the hearing that the general public doesn't have. And it's essentially like you can directly question the other party's witnesses and they actually have to answer you. And if you have your own evidence, you can present it. And like if you do get up and present evidence or witnesses, you can also be questioned. So I guess that's the only thing that you would be opening yourself up to. But you're certainly not opening yourself up to like, suddenly I'm in court and I don't want to be. Like that's not a thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Rich, all right, to piggyback on your question, Uh, I think the first thing to do is get the public up to speed on this. All right, the residents in Clifton, all right, in Covington, advertise it on your Facebook page there, and make sure that you got a lot of butts in the seats for these meetings. The zoning hearing board and the board of supervisors need to look out and see a lot of residents in that room. Something else to consider is maybe reaching out to an engineering firm that could, provide some of this technical information that you really need as far as power consumption and water consumption and noise. And I think there's enough assistance around the area here with water and EV wetlands, EV streams, that protection. But when I started bringing this up, I was getting a lot of questions from people. What's a data center? I don't understand. And definitely start there.
Part of it was what Alex started to bring up, North Pocono Care. So I have a board meeting, not next Monday, the Monday after, and I want to chat with them about, what kind of resources we should be talking about, bringing to bear and lining up to help with the communities. I have to answer to my board. I can't just arbitrarily do stuff, right? So we have to have a conversation about it. So when I meet with them in 2 weeks or a week and a half, I want to be in a position to say, here's some of the thoughts that are on the table. What direction should we take? So, I want to come in with this with some strength here versus just me showing up at meetings. You know what I mean? So, a two-pronged approach, but I agree with the butts in the seats. But at the same time, you want to be prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, in Cuba, all right, the residents that, uh, that are in Lexington Woods, we got a environmental attorney and an engineer. And, when you let them know that you have that kind of horsepower, then all of a sudden they start listening to you.
Mm-hmm.
And these individuals are giving you exactly the information that you're referring to. And so you're going in there with some horsepower.
The unfortunate thing is that there's really nothing of value on the table from their perspective. They just threw out a dart at the dartboard to say, this is the space we want to take up, but no details about any of the important aspects of it. So, I just want to be ready for when they do bring that to the table, to have people to be aware of what it means and how to advise us to fight it, really.
And one thing
Yeah.
I guess I didn't mention is even if they are successful at this stage, they will still need to go through the land development approval
Mhm.
process. So it's not like this is it.
Mhm.
There would be another process later that gets into more detail, some of the other stuff like the stormwater management.
It seems like with both the data center and the distribution warehouse, we've been kind of in like reactive mode. Is there anything we should be approaching the board of supervisors or zoning board in more proactive mode about wetland buffers, zones, or anything like
Yeah.
that?
I mean, certainly again, I haven't looked at Clifton's ordinance regarding buffers, so I can't say what they currently have in place. But yes, certainly, ensuring that there are good buffer protections around wetlands. I think, we recommend probably a 150-foot minimum. I would look at Lackawanna County must have an Act 167 plan, which is kind of the county-wide plan that talks about how this planning should go. I'm gonna Google that.
And would
Yeah.
Lackawanna counties be applicable?
Sure.
Yeah, because you're in Lackawanna
Lackawanna
County.
County.
Yeah, but could like Clifton make tight like additional?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So that might be an area where some of us could push, so that might preempt some future other things that come up that we keep whack-a-moling.
Yeah. And if you
Yep.
want, if you send me an email, I'll put my email in the chat. Care.org. I have a whole document publication that I've put together about riparian buffers and, you know, the different distances and what they accomplish and why it's important to have them around the streams and the wetlands and which streams and wetlands and all this stuff. I'm happy to share that if you would like.
I do have another question, sorry. So we're across two townships here, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, I read the application, from what it looks like, you know, it won't work with one or the other. It has to be both from a scope perspective, just the size of it, right? Do you have any experience, or could you find out where you've had two townships with different agendas? I'll put it that way. You know, one is for, one against kind of thing, how that's impacted an overall project?
I mean, honestly, these things are like, it's so new. I
Not
could
just the
try
data
to,
center,
oh,
I'm just
just
talking
for,
about overall, like from a zoning or an ordinance perspective, anything that was well out of the ordinary, trying to build across two townships that have dissimilar interests or agendas, right? I know it's a general question, but it's just trying to
yeah.
understand the dynamics that could happen there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a pretty case dependent where either, you know, if one township isn't accommodating them, then they either just, well, they'll only develop in the other township, or if it's, you know, they can't make half of the project work, they just go somewhere else.
My question to you, Bridge,
Yep.
would the townships have to sign an agreement? It looked like from their sketch, the main entrance to this project is in Clifton Township. I did not see on your sketch any entrance to the project in Covington Township. So what kind of agreements would the township have to make?
Not sure if that would require an agreement of any kind. Yeah, I guess I can't answer that off the top of my head. Like, I'm not aware of that being a thing that would have to happen, like just because part of your project is in one township and part of it's in another, and like the road happens to be in one. I don't think that's generally considered any kind of an issue.
You haven't looked at any of the ordinances yet, right, for Covington, right?
No, because I think I tried to find it and they didn't have it online.
So
So I'm
that
just
could
gonna have to like
be,
go there
yeah.
and look at it.
Hmm. So, all right, to Natalie Smith's one question. That could be something that either
Wait, never mind.
someone,
Oh, wait,
yeah.
yeah, the
There
link is
could,
broken on their website.
yeah, what I'm curious to, okay, you're familiar with the ordinance for Clifton, what they have, but if there's ordinances in Covington that are more stricter possibly when it comes to this project, and what they may want to do is provide waivers on those ordinances. And that could be something where the public might get involved and say, no, 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 you're not giving waivers on this stuff. And
Yeah, possibly.
yeah.
Yeah.
the area in Covington is not in residential zones. And so there aren't going to have the same concerns with neighbors that they will in Clifton Township. It will not be impacting them as it will for Clifton residents.
I think that's a good point. Hey, does anyone have or could anyone email me the actual proposal that was sent to Clifton? If I put my email in the chat.
Yes, I think I can do that.
Thank you.
Richard, I'd like to have that too, because the proposal, so I can speak with some knowledge to the township.
Okay. Mm. Well, I think we are, we've run quite a ways over on this, so I guess if there are no additional questions, we can call it a night. And I guess I plan to attend the hearings that are coming up, so if you're going to be there, I'll probably see you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for all of this. You're such a
Yeah, you're welcome.
resource.
Thank you, Bridget. And good
Thank
luck
you.
for
Bridget.
running
Great.
for Tobyhanna Township.
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait.
Before people shut off, can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
Sure.
Use primary election day to get word out, because that's when your residents come to vote. So you'll have a more captive audience if you have information to get out to them. We're planning to do that.
Mhm.
And that's a great way of spreading the word without having to do anything that costs you money.
Mhm. And that's, I guess, just in case folks missed it, I did put a link in the chat, like, 5 or 6 chats from the bottom, that if you don't already have it, is the link to our publication from last year. It's called Public Participation, Public Power, and it's a big old thing about all the different types of land use decisions and how to effectively participate in them. So if you're looking for more information about like how to do an effective public comment or what it means to be a party and how to do that, if you want to read more about a substantive validity challenge, you can read more in there. But that is there in that link.
Yeah.
Okay.
Faith, Faith Zerby posted a lot of stuff in the chat too.
Yes. Thank you, Faith. All right. I'm gonna say goodnight. Gonna go
All
eat some
right.
dinner.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
See you all
Bridget.
soon.
Good night, thank you.